Let me tell you how I came to this sermon. I don't usually do this, but I think it might be appropriate. In the context of Acts, I discovered this the first time I was teaching it, and I was trying to sort of polish up my Greek a little bit. And there's a word that's in the first verse. I'll read it to you the way it ought to be. Now in Joppa, there was a certain disciple whose name was Tabitha. Now that little word, it's a three-letter word in Greek, and it carries with the idea of a certain person of special significance. And I'm asking myself, what is particularly good about this paragraph, about this woman who dies, and of course there's a miracle story before it. If it's not there, would I miss it? Probably not. It's sort of a strange little thing. It has a strange ending too. It suddenly tosses in that Peter has advanced in his faith enough that he'll spend the night with a tanner. That's an unkosher job to be having in the first century. And Peter's struggling all the way through. The Lord finally, it takes him 10 years, brings Peter around with the 2 chapters, 10 and 11, with the story of Cornelius. And Peter goes back, remember, to Jerusalem and says, I figured out the Lord loves all those who seek to do his will. Now, this is Peter, the number one of the apostles, the first block in the building, the rock, the stone, according to Jesus. And so how in the world can this story of this woman, I think she may have been wealthy. She's Jewish, I know that because her Hebrew name is Tabitha, and her Greek name is Dorcas. So we've got here a Jewish lady, probably of some wealth. If not, it doesn't really matter. And she's able to sew and do things, and she made garments, outer and under. Notice the translations, well, they don't tell you that, but it's undergarments, middle garments, and jackets. I mean, it's the whole wardrobe. And she dies. And then suddenly, we have to bring Peter into the story. It's very vivid what he does. You guys get out of the room, he kneels. And in the Greek, it's very vivid. He calls her name, and he says, get up, and she does. It's just bam, bam, bam. How is this certain woman in this story of importance? Well, again, in the broad context, Luke is showing the growth of the early church from its very narrow beginnings, Acts 2, in Judaism, to the end of the book of Acts, to its claim to be a world faith. And that's what he's doing. And he takes us over about 33 years. Or maybe a little more, 35 years, showing this. And there are moments where the church grows in its understanding of what it's supposed to be and what it's supposed to do. And that's what Luke's doing throughout the book. So here's Peter journeying around doing different things in Judea and Samaria, and it's such a small story, it can be overlooked, but this is a woman of significance. I want to read you a few things from Brother J.W. McGarvey's commentary. It's from 3 pages, but I'm not going to read all 3 pages. But I want to read a few selections because this gets at the story itself. Peter's just been called. A walk of 3 hours brought the 2 men with their sad message to Peter. We're left by Luke entirely to conjecture as to the purpose for which Peter's presence in Joppa was desired, whether to minister comfort to the distressed little band of believers, which he did, in the way which is the only one left to modern preachers under such circumstances, or with the hope that he would raise the sleeping saint from the dead. It's more probable that the former was their thought, for it was not the custom of the apostles to bring back to life their deceased brothers and sisters merely because they've been useful in their lives, or my word, certain. Otherwise, Stephen and others would have been cruelly slain in the midst of their usefulness, would have been resuscitated. Now, this is kind of, when you read a text and question it, and we can't help but do it. Barclay. McGarvey's doing it here. The message to Peter as we read it was simply this: hurry, come to us now. It's urgent. Doubtless the whole story of Dorcas was told to him, for the hearts of the messengers were full of it, and Peter had his own thoughts about it as the three went on their way to Joppa. Nothing could be more graphic than the brief narrative, or more touching than the incident itself. And the march of imposing events which are moving before us, it drops like a wild flower in a stately forest. It opens a wide vista through the larger events of the history, lets light in upon the sorrow of these early saints, and discloses a scene with the like of which our own experience may have made us familiar. With deep solemnity, he motions the mourners all outside. He alone is left with the dead. He kneels down and prays. The prayer of faith he knows is heard, with a voice of authority and yet a tenderness, a voice which can be heard by the dead. He says to the cold body, "Tabitha, arise." Her eyes open. She sees Peter. She sits up and looks him in the face. Not another word passes between them, but he gently gives her his hand and helps her to her feet. He calls in the saints and widows, and there in her white shroud she stands before them alive. Here the narrative closes, and well it might, for even Luke's graphic pen could not describe the scene which followed. Okay, so why is it in there? I think, this is how I come to see it for preaching, that little things that we don't take, well, maybe we do take for granted, but little things that can be said or done mean a lot, particularly if it's said and done at the right time for us by someone. Seemingly little things, insignificant things, it seems to me have great value. Would Luke like me using it this way? I think so, because that seems to be, to me, with these women that are there showing all these garments that she's made for them, seems to be the atmosphere or the direction of the text, other than, well, you can believe that Peter's important because he raised the dead. She was well known among these people for her generosity, whether she was poor or wealthy. These weeping people said, "Look here what she's done for us, all these things she sowed." She was abounding in good deeds. She was a kind woman. And by the way, the verbs, tenses, she's always been doing this. This isn't just something she did at the last minute to get into heaven. Little sick humor there. She was always doing this. This was just her. She did her best to care and love with what she had where she was. And that's very striking. The yielded value of little things matter. And we'll know this when the books are opened, I suspect. Remember the words of Jesus when someone asked him, "When did we see you, feed you, give you drink," and so on? He replied, "As you've done it to the least of human beings, you did it to me." You thought it didn't matter, but it did. Now, we all know the truth of that. I know you do, and I do. Let me be very personal with the I do part for just a bit. There have been people, I was laying in bed last night, making a list in my head of all the people, male and female, that really shaped my life. Now, I didn't know it at the time, I don't think. But hindsight, when you get to be mature, reveals a lot. You know that as well as I do. In some cases, we may have told them, "Thank you for this. This means a lot to me." But too often, I speak autobiographically, we don't. There have been so many people in my own life that I wish I had written, called, or spoken to, some who didn't even know the impact they had on my life. Let me be personal for a bit. My first professor, who really taught me the Bible, Greek, how we got the Bible, American Christianity, other than that, didn't teach me very much. and then was my graduate professor, directed my master's thesis. I wrote him a letter one day. And it was an email, just 8 or 9 lines, the gist of which was that I've taught, hundreds of people who have taught others, and I said, I owe this all to you. You really you've made my life. I don't know where I'd be if I hadn't had your work. And he was very much an academic and a believer. I was very fortunate, thank you, God, for that one. And I get an email back from his wife within minutes and said that, I'm trying to hold my cool here, that he's wanted me to reply how much he appreciated this. He's in the bedroom crying. It meant so much to him. Now, interestingly, that's continuing to play out. When I was with my wife, when she sang at the Vatican, a little humor there, with the choir, a few weeks ago, the president of the university, who was in one of my classes with me, with this professor, wanted to know what I thought about his influence on my life. And I told him what I thought, and he said, well, me too. And I told him I differ from him in a lot of things now, because I went on and had other kind of training, very technical and blah, 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 that sort of thing. And then I find out there's another fellow who was a youth minister that was very influential in my life. So the three of us are putting together a page or two of what this man has meant to our life. And we're going to put them together and send them to him. And to which I said, we really need to hurry, because he's really mature. I'm not sure how old Steve is now, but I bet he's looking back at 80s, just to guess. And anyway, the president of the university said, it'll mean a lot to the old man. And again, I said, let's get it done. So I sent my page in, and we're going to all read each other's and try to edit it and make some sense out of it. So that's an interesting thing. I think that's what I want to grow out of a text like this. There was a psychology professor, undergraduate, that I had in don't tell anybody, I had a psychology minor. That's important that you don't tell. And I had a sociology major going too, and he had to teach one of the sociology courses. So it was influential in that sense, but where he really influenced me was on the campus. When I was a sophomore, I had a terror of the required speech course. I still am not big about getting up in front of people, and I've done it a few times. And one of the reasons is God listens. Well, that's scary. So you try to do a little of your homework so God doesn't have to do this too much. If you get my drift. And he helped me with the speech. Took me over to the library and made a couple of suggestions. It meant a lot to me. He didn't know that. I didn't even have this. I did not have the wisdom at that moment to write him a thank you note or call him or say anything. I wish I had. It means a lot to a teacher when somebody says, you really helped me in something. Then there were guys I worked for from ages 16 to 20. One was a song leader in the Church of Christ. Now, this is all back in my heathen days. And the other one was a very devout Nazarene. They were very honest men. And they taught me a lot. It was in a service station back in the day when they had them, where you vacuum the cars out, clean windshields, checked under the hood, and even the tires. Well, 2 or 3 have seen that, at least in the movies, And they shaped my life. But I was working nights. Again, don't tell the world this. They kicked me out of school after a couple of semesters for crappy grades. That's putting it mildly. Leave, don't come back for a year. I was working in a service station at night, and a funeral home during the day, etc. And there was an education professor, Dr. Carl Parker, come in at night and buy gas. And he'd say, Tyler, we were in the military together. He said, Tyler, you're too bright to be doing this. Get yourself back in school. Did it every week. I don't know if I'd have gone back to school if he hadn't done that. I never told him. That's just wrong, in my opinion. In my first church I served, I had 2 elders who stood by me vividly. And if they hadn't been there, I might have quit. But somebody said, well, that would have been a blessing. Well, anyway, whatever be the truth about that. It kept me going in my ministerial work. The list could go on. I want to remind you that nothing is ever really wasted in a believer's life, even though it doesn't look like it at the moment. And you don't have to know the solution at the moment. It's enough to know, and I think I'm going to do this sermon before I'm through, from the story of Joseph, that God is at work behind the scenes in what's called the providence of God. That's the purpose mentioned 3 times finally at the end of the Joseph story. So what you do matters, and what you say to people matters. There's a story of Gandhi I read somewhere, riding in a first-class overnight train in South Africa while he was an attorney. Remember, South Africa, way back there. A white man boarded the train, saw the dark-skinned man, and called 2 railroad officers to get this guy out of first class. Even though Gandhi had a first-class ticket, which he showed them, he refused to leave the compartment. He was tossed off the train at the next platform. Years later, he was asked what was one of the things that really shaped your life. He mentioned that incident. It was legal what he was doing, but the prejudice was over the law. He said, this has been the most life-shaping experience of my life, being removed from the train that day. Now here's a mild-mannered little Indian whose life was redirected to fight the ugliness of prejudice based on skin color. And you know how that's played out in South Africa. He took weapons borrowed from Jesus, love and nonviolent resistance. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, perhaps you know, almost made it through the war. And when we finally deposed Hitler, he killed him just before it was over. Bonhoeffer's become very, very important in theology. He says, this is in his Prisoner of God, a Prisoner for God. Much as I long to be out of here, I don't believe a single day has been wasted. What will come out of my time here is too soon to say, but something is bound to come out of it. Paul is to write, we know that in everything God works for good with those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. I think I brought up here, I did, a brief reading from Albert Schweitzer. Since I have on my academic tie today, and I've done some reading from commentaries and cited some things as well, I want to end with this. And the whole thing is to encourage you to care, and if you genuinely appreciate something, tell somebody. Anyway, here's Schweitzer, under a topic of influences. One other thing stirs me when I look back at my youthful days, namely the fact that so many people gave me something or were something to me without knowing it. Such people with whom I never perhaps exchanged a word. Yes, and others about whom I merely heard things by report had a decisive influence on me. They entered my life and became powers within me. I always think that we all live spiritually by what others have given us in significant times in our life. If we've had those before us who had thus been a blessing to us and could tell them how it came about, they would be amazed to learn what passed from their life into ours. Let's stand and sing the hymn of invitation.